Welcome to Stillwater Chronicles. Tonight, we settle into a story about a woman who began to wonder what her therapist already knew. There is something about a therapist's office that feels deliberately calm. The neutral colors chosen not by accident, but by design. The low, even lighting that doesn't quite reach the corners. The white noise machine humming gently in the corridor outside the door. A sound that is not quite silence, but is close enough to be mistaken for it. Everything arranged. Everything considered. Everything placed just so. As if the room itself has been asked to hold very still. Vivian had been coming to this office for 6 weeks. The practice was on the 4th floor of a converted Edwardian townhouse in a prosperous part of London, the kind of street where the houses had been something once and had become something else, without quite forgetting what they were. High ceilings, original cornicing, painted over so many times it had grown soft at the edges. A single sash window in the consulting room that looked out over a private garden. One of those quiet London gardens that the street has no way of knowing exists, walled and still and green. Vivian liked to look at that garden. She liked the way it sat there, unhurried, private, going about the slow business of being a garden while the city moved around it without knowing. There was something comforting about that, about the idea of a thing that simply existed, quietly, in a space that the world had agreed not to look at too closely. She thought about that garden now, sitting in the waiting room. The waiting room was small. 2 chairs upholstered in a pale gray fabric. A low table with a glass of water that was never quite full and never quite empty. A framed print of something botanical on the wall. Leaves rendered in careful ink lines, each vein precisely noted. A clock above the door whose second hand moved in that particular stuttering way, as if each second required a small effort of will. Vivian had arrived early, 12 minutes early, which was unlike her. She had left the house still pulling on her coat and found herself walking faster than the appointment required, arriving breathless in a building that had not yet been expecting her. She was not sure why she had hurried. She settled into one of the gray chairs and set her bag on the floor beside her feet and folded her hands in her lap and tried to be the kind of person who sat quietly in waiting rooms without thinking too hard about anything. The white noise machine hummed in the corridor. The clock moved its reluctant seconds forward. Outside, a car passed, distant, muffled, and then the street went quiet again. And then she heard the voice. It came from behind the consulting room door. Soft, very soft, the way voices sound when a room has been designed to contain them, but audible in the particular silence of the waiting room. Not the words, just the rhythm, the cadence, the unmistakable shape of someone speaking. Her therapist's voice. Vivian sat very still. This was not unusual, she told herself. Therapists had clients. Clients had sessions. Sessions ran before other sessions. It was the ordinary machinery of an appointment book, ticking over in a building that had been designed for exactly this kind of quiet, contained exchange. There was nothing strange about the sound of a voice behind a closed door. But she looked at the second chair. The second chair was empty. She was alone in the waiting room. The corridor beyond the glass panel in the door was empty. She had passed no one on the stairs. The buzzer downstairs had admitted only her. She had heard its single tone, had climbed the 3 flights, with no one ahead of her, and no one behind. There was no one else in the building. Vivian tilted her head, listening. The voice behind the door continued, measured, gentle, the particular pace her therapist used when she was working towards something. A pause. And then the voice again. And then, faint, but undeniable, something that sounded like a response. A second voice. Lower, less distinct. The murmur of another person in a room that should have been empty. She looked at the appointment card in her bag. 3:15 p.m. She was the 3:15. There was no 3 o'clock. The sessions had been going well. That was the thing Vivian kept returning to, in the ordinary hours of her ordinary days. The sessions had been going well. Better than she had expected. Better than she had any particular right to hope for, given that she had not been to therapy before, and had arrived at the first appointment, already half convinced it was a mistake. She had expected difficulty. She had expected the slow, uncomfortable work of explaining herself to a stranger. She had expected to feel misunderstood. Instead, it had felt like being understood too quickly. She had not used that word. Too, until the 4th session. She had thought of it as a relief. A gift, almost. The way her therapist seemed to follow her thoughts with an ease that made the sessions feel effortless. The way she reflected things back with such precision. Not just the content, but the texture, the specific weight of a feeling, the particular shade of an old grief. In the 5th session, her therapist had mentioned a dream. Not in a dramatic way, not as a revelation, casually, almost. The way you mention something you have both already discussed. She had said, the dream about the hallway. And Vivian had felt a cold shift move through her, slow as weather, because she had not mentioned any dream about a hallway. She had dreamed it. Yes, a long hallway with no end, and light that was wrong. Too flat, like a hallway in a photograph of a hallway. She had woken from it at 3 a.m. with a feeling she could not name, but she had not spoken of it. She had told herself it was too small a thing to bring to a session, too ordinary, too strange. She had said nothing. Her therapist had moved on smoothly, and Vivian had let herself believe she had misheard. And then, last week, the name. Her father had called her Vivi. Only her father. It was not a name she used with anyone. Not a name anyone used with her. Not a name she had mentioned in any of the 5 sessions. It lived in a quiet part of her. The part that held his voice. The particular way he had said it. The way it had always sounded like something small and warm in his mouth. Vivi. She had not said it out loud since the funeral. Her therapist had said it as she was leaving. Just once. Quietly, as if it were nothing. Take care of yourself, Vivi. Vivian had stopped walking, had turned. Her therapist was already writing something, already looking down at the pad of paper on her desk, pen moving with a calm certainty. She had not looked up. The door had been open. The white noise machine had hummed. Vivian had left without saying anything. She had told herself there was an explanation. She had told herself she must have mentioned it at some point. A passing reference, a moment she couldn't recall. Memory was fallible. Grief was fallible. It was possible, easily possible, that she had said more than she remembered saying. She had almost believed this. Now she sat in the empty waiting room, listening to a voice that should not have anyone to speak to, and she felt the shape of her almost shift. The voice behind the door paused. Vivian held very still. The second voice, the lower one, the one she could not quite resolve into words, said something. And then her therapist's voice again, gently. And this time, just this once, the door was not quite as good at holding the words inside. She heard her own name. Not Vivian. Vivi, said in a tone she recognized. Not as a statement. As an answer. She sat with that for a long moment. The white noise machine hummed. The botanical print observed the room with its careful ink-lined leaves. The glass of water on the table sat at its ambiguous level. Not quite full. Not quite empty. And caught the afternoon light in a way that made it look, briefly, like something other than water. She thought about the hallway dream. She thought about the way her therapist listened. That particular quality of listening. Entirely still. Eyes steady. As if she were not just hearing the words, but receiving something underneath them. Something below the level of language. Something Vivian had not chosen to give. She thought about the first session. How she had arrived already raw with the year she'd had. The grief, the insomnia, the specific exhaustion of being someone whose inner world had become too loud to live in, comfortably. How she had sat in the gray chair, across from her therapist, and felt, almost immediately, that she was in the presence of someone who already knew the shape of what she carried. She had thought it was skill. She had thought it was the particular gift of a good therapist, the ability to read what a person could not say, to understand the grammar of silence, to see the outline of a life from the few words its owner was willing to offer. Now she was not sure. The voice behind the door fell quiet. And then, a sound she recognized. The soft creak of the chair on the other side of the door. Her therapist's chair. The one that faced the window. The one that was always, in Vivian's experience, occupied by her therapist. The sound of someone sitting down. Or standing up. Settling. And then nothing. Vivian looked at the clock. 3:13. 2 minutes. She looked at the consulting room door. The handle was still. The room, as far as the door was concerned, had always been empty. She picked up her bag from the floor. She looked at it for a moment. The familiar weight of it. The texture of the strap in her hand. The small, ordinary solidity of an object that belonged unambiguously to her life. Then she set it back down. Because the door was opening. Her therapist stood in the frame of it, calm as always, in the pale blouse she often wore. Her expression the same open, unhurried expression it always was. She looked at Vivian as if Vivian were exactly what she had expected to find. As if she'd always known she would be there. As if she had perhaps known before Vivian herself had decided to arrive early. She smiled. "Vivian," she said, "come in. I'm ready for you." And Vivian, after a moment, after a breath, after the pause that hangs between knowing something is wrong and not yet knowing what to do with that knowledge, stood up, adjusted the strap of her bag, and walked through the door. The consulting room was as it always was. Two chairs facing each other across a low table. A box of tissues placed at an angle that suggested it had been considered. The window overlooking the garden still and quiet in the late afternoon light. Its walls holding the noise of the city at a distance it had long since stopped being interested in. There was no second chair. There was no indication that the room had recently held anyone but air. Vivian sat down. Her therapist sat across from her and folded her hands in her lap and looked at her with that steady, receiving attention. The white noise machine hummed in the corridor. The garden sat in its private green silence. "How have you been this week?" her therapist asked. And Vivian opened her mouth and found, to her quiet surprise, that she did not want to answer. That something in her, some careful, watchful part that had been listening since she sat down in the waiting room, thought it might be important this week to keep certain things to herself, to notice what her therapist reached for when she wasn't given it, to watch what name she might use when she thought Vivian wasn't paying attention. To pay attention. "Fine," Vivian said, and smiled, and said nothing else. The session began. Outside, the garden held its silence. The walls held the city out. And somewhere, in the quiet space between what Vivian said and what her therapist already seemed to know, a question sat, patient, still, unhurried as that garden, waiting to be asked. Thank you for listening to Stillwater Chronicles, where even the quietest rooms can hold the loudest questions. If this stillness stayed with you, if something in you is still watching the door, then let it remain a little while longer. Some questions are not meant to be answered. They are only meant to sit with you, quietly, in a room with a window and a garden that the city cannot see. Rest now. You are safe here.